we call this a Smart Negotiator workshop. And the whole idea is that you walk away with tools, with concepts that will be actionable and help you negotiate better whatever you have to negotiate. As you can imagine, negotiation is pretty universal, and I'll talk about it from that perspective, how we negotiate both in our business life and in our personal life. So a little bit about us before I begin with the topic. We have some 30 years of global experience doing trainings, in-house trainings, universities, and consulting for complex deals. We've worked sort of all over the world, and for me that has been quite a privilege in the sense that culture has a huge impact in negotiation, and a lot of times we overlook the importance of cultural differences in negotiation. And as I travel, I can see how huge that impact can be in a negotiation, for good or for bad. So we'll talk a little bit about culture in a transversal manner, but I do want to emphasize what is important about culture when you negotiate across cultures. My academic experience, I've been a professor at McGill for some 23 years for the School of Management, the BComs, the MBAs, and the executive MBAs now. I was a trainer at Columbia University for something called the ICCCR, which was a conflict resolution center. We had a contract at that time that was like 10 years with the United Nations, and we used to teach members of the United Nations conflict resolution and mediation in different stations throughout the world. That's one of the reasons I traveled quite a bit at some point. My alma mater is Kellogg. I did my executive MBA at Kellogg. And I was for 10 years part of something called the KIN, the Kellogg Innovation Network. I was part of the advisory committee of the Kellogg Innovation Network. And last but not least, I've been a professor at Universidad de los Andes, which is one of the major universities in Colombia, the leading university in Colombia, since 1993. So that's sort of my academic career. In terms of industries, as you can see, we've worked with all types of industries. In training, in consulting, we've worked with governments. A very fascinating negotiation was helping the Colombian government, and this is sort of relevant nowadays with tariffs, negotiate the free trade agreement with the United States. That was quite a fascinating negotiation. We started with Bush and we finished with Obama. And now things are getting tricky, so we'll see what happens with everything we did. So worked quite a bit with governments, with NGOs, with for-profit, for non-profit, in different types of negotiations. So that's sort of my experience, both academic and as a practitioner, which, by the way, is great because as an academic, I have to be sort of in the state of the art of what's happening in the field of negotiation. And as a practitioner, I can see how that is brought up to practice. So that back and forth has been quite fun and quite enriching. You were going to say something?
I was just going to ask, Negotiation by Design, is that the name of your company?
Oh, sorry. Yes, I should have. Negotiation by...
It's a company of...
Is a boutique? No, is a boutique. We're 3 partners. Since you ask, one is in Buenos Aires, in Argentina, the other one is in Quito, Ecuador, and I'm in Colombia. And we mainly, most of our work is in the Americas, but yeah, we work as a boutique. Yeah, thank you for the question. And we call it Negotiation by Design, basically because I love design thinking, but also because I'm convinced that you design your negotiations. It's something you make happen. It's not something you let happen, it's something you intentionally make happen. So that's a little bit about my professional experience. Colombia, I don't know, has anybody been to Colombia? No? Okay, so Colombia is in the tip of northern tip of Latin America. We have both oceans. The Andes, which comes all through here, splits in 3 in Colombia, and that makes us one of the most biodiverse countries in the world. That we're big on biking because of the mountains. We have really good bikers. This guy, again, won the Tour de France, I think 3 years ago. Very proud of him, of course. As I said, oh, we have 100 Years of Solitude. You read that, yeah? Or at least you see the series in Netflix. Okay, so Nobel Prize in Literature. We have a really good coffee. The second most biodiverse country in the world after Brazil, of course. We have also a Nobel Peace Prize who signed a peace treaty after 50 years of unrest with the FARC guerrilla. This is Encanto. If you see that, this is a very interesting movie, and I like to bring it because what they did is they took like different regions from Colombia, which is very diverse culturally, and they put it into one movie. So it's quite interesting. And if you're not impressed by this, we have Shakira and Karol G. Okay, so that's a little bit about Colombia. About myself, I love traveling. This is a picture of me in Japan. The reason I used to go to Japan very often is because McGill had an MBA program in Tokyo. There's a whole story behind that, but I used to go to Japan every year. Love Japan, and it was sort of like a vacation because they made me travel in business. I taught 2 weekends, and the rest of the time was free time to travel around Japan. I loved, that mixture of extremely modern culture with extremely traditional culture at the same time. About negotiation, one of my biggest challenges has been to negotiate throughout his teenage years with my son Matteo. He's now 20, going to school in LMU. He's studying cinema. So he's been a great coach. I mean, if you can negotiate with a teenager, you basically can negotiate with anybody. And Annabelle, my 12-year-old, with her it's very easy. I say yes to everything so far. Now I have some tips for when she grows up to be a teenager. I may call you. So great coaches, both of them. To make things even more interesting, my partner is Swedish. And if we want to talk about cultural differences, there is a simplified way to look at culture, which is some cultures are polychronic and some cultures are monochronic. Polychronic cultures place a lot of value on relationships. It doesn't mean that monochronics don't, but we're driven a lot by the quality of the relationships, the quality of the connections, the quality of the interactions. Monochronic cultures value time a lot, so they're driven by how well you use time, how well you perform in the use of time. I'm polychronic, which means I don't have any problem starting half an hour late. She's monochronic. She would have a huge problem starting half an hour late. So that's also interesting. I like wine. This is me in a restaurant in Montreal that I love, Vin Papillon. I don't know if you've been there. If you haven't, it's great. This was a very interesting cultural experience too, because I was doing a workshop in Riyadh some 3 months ago, and it went well. Very different culture, of course, in many ways. Very similar because they're also polychronic, so in many ways we met. But at the end of the workshop, I said, look, you cannot show this picture in Riyadh. If you show a picture of yourself drinking wine, and that's how he said it, I don't know if it's that extreme. It's like if you were showing somewhere else a picture of you using heroin. That's, okay. So you cannot show this picture, it's not culturally correct. Well, I like cooking. That's Annabelle, a lot smaller, of course. And in my free time, I'm passionate about mountain biking. This is me in Utah. If you are mountain bikers, it's sort of the mecca of mountain biking. Okay, so that's about me. So you know who's speaking here today. Going now to negotiation, I like to start with this idea of what is the problem we're trying to solve with our value offer, with our training, with our consulting. And probably this has to do with my experience seeing what happens when we do training in organizations and we come back later to see how that training impacted the organization. So we've identified, and maybe I shouldn't say we, I think it has been identified that most negotiators, and I know this is like a harsh claim to begin the workshop with, reach suboptimal deals. According to Kellogg, some research they did, 80% of negotiators reach suboptimal deals. So what does that mean? It means that either they leave value on the table, which means they reach a deal and they could have reached a better deal that would have been better for both parties, which somehow doesn't make sense. You know, why reach a deal that is less optimal than a better deal? We're going to explore this because this is one of the most important aspects in negotiation. But this is extremely common. Negotiators tend to leave value on the table. The other way to reach suboptimal deals, and I think sometimes we can relate to this better, is we settle for too little. We have this sense that, okay, I ended up with a very small slice of the pie, and there was really no reason for that. Why did I ended up with such a suboptimal deal compared to the deal my counterpart got? I ended up with too little compared to what I could have gotten. This is different from the previous one, because the previous one is what we call win-win negotiations. Win-win negotiations is I could have improved the deal for me, and I could have improved the deal for you without making the deal for me worse. This is win-lose negotiations. They got a lot more value than I got, and it doesn't really make sense that they did. And as they made the deal better for them, they made the deal worse for me. Does that make sense? Okay. We'll revisit this in much more detail, but I want you to give you that flavor of why we reach suboptimal deals before we begin. The fourth reason is we settle for something less than our badna. If you've ever taken a negotiation course or read a book, you've heard the concept badna. Badna comes from a book called, I'm sure a lot of you have read it, Getting to Yes, which is still a very important book. It's perhaps the first relevant book about negotiation. The author is Roger Fisher, a professor at Harvard, and he was sort of the pioneer in this field. And BADNA means best alternative to a negotiated agreement, which means what is my plan B? If I don't reach a deal with you, what is the best plan B I have? That's what what BADNA means. And sometimes, for reasons that I'll explain in a moment, people accept something which is worse than their BADNA. So that doesn't make sense. Why would I reach a deal with you if I can do something better with somebody else? So that means also in negotiation, you don't always have to reach a deal. Sometimes the best deal in negotiation is no deal. You need to walk away. We talked a little bit about that last night at dinner, or you talked a little bit about that. Sometimes you want to walk away because your BADNA is better. So that doesn't make sense. Why does this happen? Because a lot of times people don't think about their BADNA. They don't think about what can I do if I don't reach a deal. And we're going to look at this more carefully and see that this is critical. You should always be thinking about what is my BADNA and how can I improve my BADNA. And the opposite mistake is you walk away from deals that are better than your BADNA. That happens a lot also. Sometimes it's for emotional reasons, pride. I'm not going to negotiate with Pete, I don't like him. So I know it's better to reach a deal with him, but I'm walking away. So a lot of times we walk away because we get emotional, or also because we did not assess our BADNA correctly. So assessing the BADNA, the best alternative to negotiated agreement, is a critical part of negotiation. But we'll look at that. Pete, yes?
So thinking about the BADNA and people settling for worse than BADNA, and what role do you think corporate sort of HR policies where BD people are told you have to sign 2 deals this year to get your bonus? Is there an interplay with that, do you think? And is there a recommendation that could be explored where people are pushed away from metrics of signing deals as a recommendation?
Yeah, I think you covered the answer a little bit. A lot of times it has to do with misalignment of interest between the negotiator and the corporation. I mean, if you if your bonus is at stake, if you don't close the deal, even if the deal is not so good, but your motivation is, and we talked about that last night, you always should be looking about, Tim mentioned, if you're negotiating, you should always begin by what are my motivations, what are the motivations? And motivations drive decisions, right? There's different things that create motivations, but if I want to lose my commission, I might as well sign a mediocre deal so I don't lose my commission. That's one. The other one is, and I'm going to talk about it in a moment, is metrics. What metrics is the organization using to tell its negotiators what's a good deal? And we're going to see that wrong metrics, biases, create biases that makes their negotiators negotiate poorly. So metrics becomes very critical. And the trick is in negotiation is setting those metrics is not so easy. We're going to see why in a moment, but it's critical. We're going to see that there's 3 types of metrics in negotiation, what we call substantive metrics, like payment terms, price, length of contract. Those could be substantive metrics. But there should also be relational metrics, and we talked about that last night too. What is the quality of the relationship I want to have with this person when I walk when after the deal? Because, by the way, and you were right, most of the time we negotiate with people with whom we're going to negotiate again and again, or who can affect our reputation. So, relational metrics become very critical. And then the last set of metrics, which is very substantive to negotiating effectively, is process metrics, which is metrics that measure if you're following the process of negotiation correctly. Because we know that if you don't follow the process, the outcome is probably not going to be good. And I'll address that also in a moment. Any questions up to here? Yes, please.
Maybe you'll get to this later on. Obviously, some deals are suboptimal, but I'm kind of curious as to who conducted this analysis that the deal was suboptimal. How did they evaluate it?
Yeah, the reason every major university has done that. I'm partial to Kellogg, as you can see. So I know they did this. They get executives from all over the world. So they use the simulations in the classroom to measure those outcomes. And let me get ahead of myself. There is a huge problem in negotiation, and sometimes that's why people don't pay so much attention about, how can I negotiate more effectively, or how can my organization become more effective at negotiation. The problem in negotiation is that the value available to negotiate in a deal is hidden. You don't see it. So there's no way in real life that you can sit down and say, okay, did we leave value on the table? Unless there is full disclosure, which is almost impossible, and I'll address that too, you don't know. But when we're teaching, we're using simulations in which we know the full potential of value. So I think that's how they measure it. I'm sure they also did other type of measures, but I know they did a lot of research based on that. Does that answer your question? Okay, this is the other very interesting observation. This is from my experience, but also from research, since you like research, from a guy called Danny Ertel at Harvard. I rarely, and I'm going to say rarely, but I could also almost say never, I rarely have found an organization that has in place a negotiation system. Do you know an organization that has a rigorous, systematic negotiation system? Not easy, right? Maybe some guidelines, but
What do you mean by system?
like, do you have a marketing system in your organization? Do you have a financial system in your organization? Yeah, it's very strict, right? Yeah, but fairly strict, right? You have to do it in a certain way. You cannot say, okay, this morning I'm going to look and negotiate the finances this way. There is a strict system, okay. And that fascinates me, because how important is negotiation to any organization? very important, not so important. I think it's terribly important. You negotiate everything. You negotiate with customers, you negotiate with suppliers, you negotiate with the government, you negotiate M&As, you negotiate IP, you negotiate with colleagues, you negotiate with employees, you're negotiating all the time. And yet organizations don't have a system. So why is that? And what are the consequences of that? Well, the first one is that what we see, and this is how we started our business, at best, what they do is they send people to trainings, Harvard, Kellogg, MIT, or negotiation by design. And they hope that if they train those individuals will come back to the organization and do a great job. So, well, probably, if not, I wouldn't have a job, but still, the approach they're going to use is ad hoc. Each individual is going to take what they learned and they're going to apply it in their best, with their best criteria. But that doesn't necessarily mean there's a homogeneous approach to negotiation throughout the organization. And what we believe is that creates inconsistency and reduces effectiveness, which brings me to the next slide. If you have really good negotiators, star negotiators, hero negotiators, where is your negotiation knowledge? All the experience you've developed in each one of your organizations, where is that knowledge? It's in your head, it's tacit. And when those people leave, what happens? I mean, maybe they were really good mentors and they taught other people how to do things, but that's still ad hoc, and that's still the motivation of a person that says, I'm going to be a good mentor. But that knowledge usually lives with them. It's not accumulated in the organization, which again surprises me, because if negotiation is so important, why do organizations not think about how can I keep this knowledge? How can I build learning curves in negotiation? And the fourth problem, which of course relates to the previous, is we see organizations use inappropriate metrics. They use very transactional metrics, very short-term metrics, very financial metrics, all things that are, by the way, easier to measure, but they don't think about things like, okay, what are the long-term metrics that I'm aiming at? How does the metrics for this negotiation align with the objective, the strategic objectives of the organization, to the type of relationships I want to develop with my key partners? Every organization has a whole group of key partners. What are the type of relationships I want to create with those people? And again, as I said, we're going to see that there is substantive metrics, relational metrics, and process metrics that you should put in place if you want your negotiators to negotiate effectively. Any questions up to here? So let me try to bring this to a better explanation, perhaps. So my question is, what is the quality of your outcomes in negotiation, of the outcomes you are getting in your negotiation? And let me be more precise. Are you reaching acceptable deals? Could you reach better deals? Or are you absolutely certain that you are always reaching optimal deals? What do you think? Where are you?
I'd say from your perspective. From what perspective?
From the perspective of, okay, good question.
From the company or from the deal?
Very good question. So, why do I negotiate? Why do people negotiate? There's only one reason people negotiate: to maximize value capture. Negotiation is a tool to get for yourself as much value as you can. And by value, I don't mean financial value only. I mean relational value, lots of value. Value is anything that's important to you. And you're touching a point, right? There is the value that the organization captures. There's the value that the individual who's negotiating on behalf of the organization captures. So there is different drivers, different motivations when it comes to value. But you're negotiating to capture value. Do we agree on that? Yeah. So that's what you're doing. So that's the question. Are you capturing an acceptable amount of value? Could you capture more value than you're capturing, or are you certain you're capturing optimal value? There is a Nobel Prize that has this concept that I read a few years ago, which I found very relevant to negotiation, which is satisfying and optimizing. Have you ever heard of that? Okay, so satisfying and optimizing is most of us, when we problem solve, when we make decisions, and when we negotiate, once we find an acceptable solution, we stick with that. And we don't necessarily look for optimizing, which is, okay, this solution works. Can I find a better solution? Very often, there's a good reason. We don't have time to do the better solution. But in some other circumstances, we should, because there's a lot at stake. But we don't. Because once people, and it happens especially in negotiation, find an acceptable deal, they stick to that acceptable deal. And they don't try to optimize the deal. So for some deals, could be good. Yes, Pete.
When you're,
Yeah.
When you're negotiating, so let's say you're going into a deal. Before you start negotiating, you do your assessment, you try to understand the total value, you try to understand the value for yourself, for the partner, and then you figure out what
could be a good outcome.
The best outcome you can possibly negotiate, or the best outcome you can get, and then you get your BATNA, and you assume that somewhere in between is where you're going to land.
Yeah.
And I was fortunate enough to have the opportunity to participate in another negotiation course through this organization.
With the Wharton professor. Jeff told me.
So
yeah.
One of the things that came out of that was that when you have two people from different perspectives, most of the time you'll end up halfway in between.
Yeah, most people, that's a cognitive bias. That's called splitting the difference. And remember, Chris Voss says, never split the difference, because that may not be the best outcome. But we're going to talk quite a bit about there's 240 or more cognitive biases documented in Wikipedia. But I think there is even more than that. There is some really relevant cognitive biases to negotiation that we need to address, because if you're not aware of them, they're going to bias you. Harvard has a concept that I love, which is the first thing you need to do with your customer is to de-bias your customer. And we'll see what biases you in negotiation in a moment. Splitting the difference is a bias. Because, if you started here and it really doesn't make sense, and they started here and it really doesn't make sense, why does the middle make sense? Yeah, but people split the difference. Yes?
I guess most of the solutions that I've been using are driven by financial metrics. And I know there are other metrics for sure. Going from acceptable financial metrics for both parties all the way to optimal often is a shift of value from one side to the other. And if that were to happen, we're risking actually even getting the acceptable.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I can guarantee that I've never done an optimal deal. Have I done acceptable or done a better deal?
Okay, let me define optimal better, because I think you're right. But you reminded me of 3 pitfalls people fall into when they negotiate. And this has been researched by Harvard, the program on negotiation. They say there's 3 typical pitfalls negotiators are vulnerable to, or have a tendency to fall into. The first one is the obvious one. Is negotiation is a zero-sum game. Does that sound familiar? Yeah, okay. That's a huge wrong belief. My experience as a consultant in complex negotiations is very rare that deals are completely win-lose or zero-sum. But when you have that mindset, which even me still have, is we engage in negotiation as an adversarial process. And we end up in a win-lose dynamic instead of a win-win and then win-lose, because you have to use both approaches. A good negotiator, to be clear up front, first makes the pie bigger, but then Once they make the pie bigger, they walk away with a big slice of that new pie. So that's what we call the dilemma of negotiation between collaborating to make the pie bigger and competing to walk away with a big slice of the pie. That's what a good negotiator does. You're not a good negotiator if you're always getting the biggest slice of very small pies. You're not good. And you're not good either if you're making the pie bigger and the other person walks away with the pie. So you have to be good at both. And that's what we call the dilemma between collaboration and competition, which is sort of what you're touching, because if you compete too much, you can break the deal. Fair. The second pitfall is emotions. We get emotional very easy. And once we get emotional and an ego gets in the way, we make wrong decisions. I'm not going to mention examples, but I'm sure you can think of them. And the third one is preparation. People don't prepare enough. Harvard says you should spend 70% of your time preparing and 30% of your time negotiating. We do the opposite. Yeah. So those are the three pitfalls, and they're really good to think about, because that's what you want to avoid if you want to become more effective at negotiation. But let me move forward. Most of you, or some of you, maybe not most of you, probably heard of this example before. So please let those who don't know the example sort of struggle with it. Everybody uses this example because it's too elegant. So here we go. So Mary Parker Follett came up with this example. She used to write in the 1930s. She was a pioneer in the field of negotiation. And her story goes this way. Two siblings, and I'm sure you have had similar experience if you have kids, were fighting over the last orange left in the house. And then my question is, for those of you who do not know the example, because I know if you answer, you probably know the example, how would you resolve this dispute? How do people normally resolve this dispute? How do parents normally resolve this dispute? What do? They split it in half. Most people will split the orange in half. It's an acceptable deal. It's fair. Why would one sibling get more orange than the other? And it protects the relationship. Maybe they're partially satisfied with our orange meter, but because it's fair, they're okay with it. These girls were probably, what do you say? They were 8, 9, 10 in the 1930s, so they're probably dead. So these two girls died thinking that they reached a really good deal. Yeah, because that's what they saw. Of course, motivations. Do you think it's possible to find a better outcome? Yes, because again, I wouldn't have a job if that wasn't true. So what happens if you find out that one of them wants to drink juice and the other one wants to bake a cake? Well, if that's true, the person who wants to drink juice takes away 100% of the pulp, and the person who wants to bake a cake walks away with 100% of the peel. And then they're both fully satisfied. So which deal should they reach? Splitting the orange in half or doing this? Obviously doing this. But this won't happen unless they understand their motivations. Does that make sense? Okay, so I could spend the rest of the day talking about this, but let me spend at least 10 minutes. Negotiation is about maximizing value capture. We agree with that? And value could come in the form of relationships, of money, of many, many things. My values, my principles, that's all valuable to me. And people are driven by what's valuable to them, about what's important to them. That's what drives them in negotiation. The problem in negotiation, or let me put it differently. Negotiation is problem solving. Do you agree with that? Yeah, we are interdependent. We want to work together to find a deal that works for both of us. At least a deal that's acceptable. Okay? I'm an engineer. To full disclosure, I'm a mechanical engineer. So, what did my professors always tell me about problem solving? What is the first step to solve a problem? You need to understand the problem. What is the problem? Okay. In a negotiation, who can solve the problem? I'm negotiating with Pete. Who can come up with a solution? Me? Both. Pete could come up with a better solution than me if he understands the problem. So in negotiation, I need my counterpart to understand the problem. Why? Because the best possible solution can come from them. If they don't understand the problem, I may lose a better solution than the one I could think of. Does that make sense? Okay. What do I need to understand the problem? Information. Yeah, I need to talk to the other party, but information. Who has the information? I have part of the information, and Pete has part of the information. Sorry, you've been talking to me, so I'm using an example. So we both have the information. On my own, I don't have all the information. You have part of the information, and I have part of the information. So what's terribly important in negotiation? That we share a lot of information. And let me, because I know this is one of the paradigms that people hate, is people still think that negotiation is like poker. There's a gentleman we know that always talking about cards. Yeah, they're good cards, bad cards. Negotiation has nothing to do with poker. That's a bad analogy. Because poker, you're trying to win. In negotiation, you don't care if the other party gets a better outcome. Negotiation is never about getting a better outcome than your counterpart. It's about getting the best possible outcome for you, no matter what the other party gets. Well, yes, matter. If you care about the relationship, you want them to do well. But in terms of, you're not comparing. I mean, that's a bad motivation in negotiation because it's going to drive you to a win-lose outcome. Okay, that said, effective negotiators share a lot of information. Not everything. We're going to look at a case in a moment, and we're going to see what information you should share and what information you should not share. But in general, effective negotiators share a lot of information. So let me fine-tune that concept. Yes, there is always a risk in sharing information, but the cost of not sharing information is more often higher than the risk of sharing information. It's very costly in important negotiations not to share information. If the girls wouldn't have shared information, they would have lost 50% of the value. Because I take the orange, make my juice, and I throw away the peel. That's a waste of value. Nobody gets that value. The next caveat is you do not know what information is useful until you share it. That's a problem in negotiation. You do not know if this piece of information is going to be useful until you share it. So information exchange is a fundamental part of effective negotiation. Does that make sense? Yes, there is information we don't share, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. Okay, if you want people to share information, what's fundamental? Trust. If you don't trust each other, information exchange is going to be very difficult. So trust is a fundamental part of the negotiation. So here comes, if you walk away with this and nothing else, I think my trip here was worth it. There's a mantra for me in negotiation, and it's not mine, it's Roger Fisher's. Good negotiators focus on the process, not on the outcome. Why is that fundamental? To begin with, because before you engage with your counterpart, you have no idea what is the optimal outcome. You cannot know what the optimal outcome is. It's impossible because you don't have all the information. And you will never have all the information, which is the problem we identified a moment ago. So you cannot say, oh, my target is to get as much orange as I can. If any of the two girls engages in negotiation with that outcome in mind, they're going to reach a win-lose outcome because they're aiming at getting more orange. If they focus on the process, what do? They say, one of the ABCs of negotiation is always go back to interest. Every time you reach an impasse, go back to interest. Here, if we start talking about the orange, and the way they can talk about the orange is typically, well, I saw it first. Well, I'm older than you. Well, I gave you my banana this morning. It's only fair that you give me the orange. That's justifications. That's a typical dynamic in negotiation. And then when we get desperate, we go threats, which is, you don't want to give me the orange? I'm going to tell my mother. I'm not lending you my bike this afternoon. That's what we call power-based negotiation and rights-based negotiation, which is the tendency our ego particularly has in, I want to be right and I want to prove you wrong. I have a right to the orange because I saw it first, right? And if you don't agree, I'm more powerful. So I'm going to, tell my mother that you didn't let me have the orange, or I'm not lending you the bike, or whatever it is. What we're proposing is, yes, sometimes we need to use right-based approaches. Sometimes we need to use power-based approaches, but you're much better off beginning by interest-based negotiation, which is before you engage in negotiation, you need to understand your interest, which people sometimes don't, and you need to understand your counterpart's interest. There is a guy called Rappaport from Harvard, and his rule was, I will never engage in the negotiation phase before I'm quite certain that I have understood my interest, that I have understood their interest, that they have understood my interest, and that they have understood their interest. So it's four challenges you have, Pete.
I was going to ask, what if the orange is in a bag? You're going to put a sort of a situation that happens very often. The orange is in a bag, so we don't know it's an orange, right? So neither party knows. They know something about it. They know it's food, but they don't know if they like the food. That's the analogy, right? It's a lunch bag. Both of us are hungry, but we don't know
what is in it.
What it is.
Yeah.
And
Very
there's no
good.
way to know what that is for 5 or 6 years from now, which is what many deals are about in business development. Right? It's you're negotiating for a theoretical value.
Well, you have tools that you use, I'm sure, like due diligence, right? There's tools you use, but it's very hard to negotiate when you don't know what the value is. I mean, when you're doing partnerships, when we do help people do partnerships, we spend a lot of time helping them understand their motivations, because we know that if we do so, they probably will reach a better deal. What resources are you bringing? What capabilities are you bringing? What resources are you looking for? What capabilities are you looking for? Because if I understand how I can be valuable to you and how you can be valuable to me, of course. So this idea of really understanding people's motivations is critical to negotiation. But I want to go back to this idea. Good negotiators focus on the process and not on the outcome. One element of the process is, what is the interest of my sister? As soon as I do that, I have a better chance to find value. So those are the process metrics I was talking about. You want your negotiators to do better, give them better metrics. Have you built trust? No, you're going to probably leave value on the table. Have you understood the other party's interest and share your interest with your counterpart? No, you're probably going to leave value on the table. Have you understood the priorities you have and their priorities they have? No, you're probably going to leave value on the table. Have you used techniques like MESOs, multiple equivalent simultaneous offers? No, you're probably going to leave value on the table. Have you prepared? No, you're probably going to leave value on the table. So it's ex-ante metrics that we know make it more probable that you will find the value. They don't guarantee that you will find the value, but they increase the probability of you finding the value, because it is very unusual in a negotiation that you really truly know before you engage with your counterpart, and even if you engage with your counterpart, what the optimal outcome is. You know that you did everything to optimize the outcome, but you don't know what the optimal outcome is. I do, because when I do these simulations, I have full information from one side and full information from the other. And that's how I can show you whether you left value on the table or not. Does that make sense? So now you have a process for negotiation. You know that you need to build trust. First, you know that you need to exchange information. Second, you know that you need to define the problem. You know that you need to find solutions. There is a process to negotiation. And again, I want to emphasize, the challenge is that in negotiation, value is hidden. You don't see it until you see it. So you don't know how much value is available out there, but you know how you can increase the probability of finding it now. Does that make sense? So when you ask people about their outcomes in negotiation, and this is true, is most people, when you ask them, will tell you 90% of the time that they think they reach good outcomes. They walk away because they reach acceptable outcomes. They'll tell you, oh, my outcome was good. They don't know. All they know is it was acceptable. That's all they know. And Kellogg, and that's your research again, says that in their research, 80% of negotiators leave on average 20% of value on the table. Let's call it 1%. That in aggregate is huge. If you're systematically leaving 1% of value on the table in every deal you do, at the end you lose a lot of value, right? Okay. So after knowing this, are you optimizing your outcomes in negotiation? It's hard to know. It's hard to know. But now we know what we can do to increase the probability of optimizing the outcomes. So let me talk a little bit about our approach and why our approach goes this way. This is something we've built throughout the years. The idea we had from a book that's pretty clever is called Three-Dimensional Negotiation. We spinned it around with our own experience. So what we are claiming is that every effective negotiator leverages 3 dimensions. There is a tactical dimension in negotiation, there is a value dimension in negotiation, and there is a strategic dimension in negotiation. So you have 3 sources of leverage in negotiation. What we observe is that most people are very tactical. They think negotiation is a tactical process. They even think that negotiation is about sitting at the table. We're going to see that that's not true. Negotiation starts long before you sit at the table. What is the tactical aspect of negotiation? Well, things that you know. And it has to do with how do I create the appropriate interaction with my counterpart. I like this concept, and sorry, this is a new slide, so I have young designers, and they don't realize that we older people, our eyesight starts faltering. So here it says, let me use this trick, soft with the people, tough with the problem. That's something that I like, again, from Roger Fisher. Good negotiators are soft with the person, and they're tough with the problem. That's a good idea. So, of course, negotiation begins with building credibility and trust. That's fundamental, and that's should be intentional, and we talk about that in a moment. Yeah, they made it very small. Sorry about that. They exchange information effectively, mostly about, and this is a good guideline, about interest, what motivates me, priorities, what's more important to me, and preferences, what would I like, okay? Manage cultural difference effectively, and here a small parenthesis, because we won't have time to go into culture for really in depth. Polychronic, monochronic is a good guideline, or high context, low context is a good guideline. In negotiation, there's 2 aspects of that that are really important. Monochronic people value time a lot. They place a lot of value on time. Cultures are defined in a simple manner by values, beliefs, and norms. Values is what's important to that culture. Beliefs is, if I do this, what will happen? And norms is, this is the appropriate behavior. Those are the 3 simple ways to explain a culture, if you want. So they value time. Why do they value time? Because they believe that in order to be effective, you have to manage time effectively. That's what makes you effective, really using your time effective, because that's a really scarce resource. And the norms are, you have a meeting, you arrive at 8, not at 8:30, but that's okay, I'm polychronic. So you arrive on time, that's the norm. You come prepared to the meeting. You don't do like the Latins do, that we start talking about football and the weekend. You come prepared, and the 3 points we're gonna address today as 1, 2, and 3. They're very strict with agenda. That I discovered with COVID. You know, they start putting. I start missing meetings when they put 9:15. 'Cause I never started meeting at 9:15, and so I used to arrive late because 9:15 looks like 9:30. So why would I put a meeting at 9:15? So that's, if you want, some norms that monochronic people follow. Polychronic people place a lot of value on two things, many things, but two things. That's why it's called poly. Relationships. That has a lot of value, and quality of life, which is sort of related to that's why the French say, je travaille pour vivre, je vis pas pour travailler. There we go. So that's something, that's polychronic. So their belief is, if I want to get things done, and this works in the Middle East very well in Latin America, you have to have the right relationships. That's how you get things done. And norms is, you spend time relationship building. When you engage with someone, you spend the necessary time to build connections. And polychronic people like me, we look for connections even in transactional interactions. We need the connection. We believe that connections are fundamental because we're not only thinking about the short-term relationship, we're thinking about the long-term relationship. So there's two elements in negotiation that are critical. How do we build trust and how do we communicate? There's many other aspects that we could look at, but since we have a little time, let me just talk about these two. Polychronic cultures, to build trust, need connections. That's why I spend some time on my slides telling you about Colombia, telling you about my background, telling you about my kids, because that makes me more human, that connects me with people who care about these things. Connections are fundamental. And the way we communicate is not very direct. We don't like conflict. We take conflict personally. So if you disagreeing with you, that's not comfortable because that sort of, you don't like me. If you like me, you would agree with me. So we are indirect. We don't feel too comfortable sharing information. So I just told you sharing information is critical in negotiation. We polychronic people are not really good at sharing information. We see negotiation as something competitive. So telling you about my interests, that's not such a good idea. Monochronic people, and of course I'm simplifying, of course I'm stereotyping, but these are guidelines, and always remember that there's always normal distributions in cultures. So I'm talking about the mean, the average of a polychronic and monochronic culture. Monochronic cultures, trust is, do you deliver? It's about your performance. It's about your transparency. You told me that you were going to send me the proposal on Tuesday at 3. You didn't send it to me. I don't trust you. You told me you would be here at 3. You were not here at 3. I don't trust you. It's about performance. And communication is very direct. I don't want to waste time with you. So this is what I want. This is what I don't want. These are my limits. Very straightforward. You can see how that can become a horrible interaction between both, right? And just to finish this, there's a lot more to talk about culture, of course. There is always a question. It says, yeah, but Japanese people are very punctual, and you say they're polychronic. And that's fascinating because they're punctual out of respect for the person. Monochronic people are punctual out of respect for the task. So it's very different. The motivation is different. Monochronic cultures are about the task. Polychronic cultures are about the relationship. And that's a good guideline to start understanding when you're engaging with a different culture, why do they behave so differently? That helps? Okay. So neutralize hardball tactics. I'm going to give you access to our newsletter. I have lots of articles addressing this, but hardball tactics is important. We have identified 14 hardball tactics. This is sort of fun because there's still people who believe that hardball tactics work in negotiation. Design and present offers and counter offers. That's critical negotiation. Once I understand interest, priorities, and preference of both parties, how do I convert that into a value proposition that's good for my counterpart and good for me? Reduce cognitive biases. That's a really huge one. We're going to talk about different cognitive biases. There's different. There's anchoring, there's overconfidence, there is reactive evaluation, there's confirmation bias. Anchoring is a really critical one, so let me explain it to you. we were helping a corporation that had a huge mix of products that they would sell to their distributors. And the VP of sales was concerned because the mix of products was so large and so complex. People had his key accounts had a very difficult time calculating whether the deal was good or not, because they had to talk about volume, about price, about payment terms, about length of contract, about rebates, about discounts, and putting all that in your head was very difficult. So he was very proud because he developed an app for the phone in which his key accounts would input the conditions of the deal, and the app on the phone would tell them, you have reached break-even, or you're below break-even, or you're above break-even. And that was meant to be a guideline with the hope that if they were break-even, then they would make an effort to make the deal better. And if they were below break-even, they were at least going to try to get break-even or above. And he said, that's brilliant. That solves the problem. He says, no, that creates the worst problem you can have. You're biasing your key accounts. Because what's break-even? Is your worst possible deal. So you're anchoring your key accounts to your worst possible deal with the hope that because they know that that's break-even, they're going to make an effort to. But if it's the end of the month, they're not going to care about that. They're going to care about closing the deal, because if not, they don't get their commission, right? That's to add to the problem. So we did a tweak. It says, no, don't do that. Just, input in the app the margin you want. Don't tell them break-even, because as soon as you take them break-even, you anchor them to the reservation point, and they're going to negotiate poorly. If you remember the Freakonomics book, it says, you never tell your agent what your reservation point is on your house. Because if you tell your agent what the reservation point is on your house, that's what you get for your house. So you give them a target, you don't tell them your reservation point. So just with that tweak, we de-bias the key accounts, because now they did not know what break-even was. They only knew that the acceptable deal to the VP was what the app told them, and the app incorporated a margin. Does that make sense? Use principal persuasion as objective criteria. That's fundamental in negotiation. It's about, I want this salary because my market value is this, so the salary I'm asking makes sense, because people will normally will respect those principles. If they are in agreement with those principles, we have to be careful with that. When we're negotiating across cultures, principles can be very different. Channel emotions productively and avoid emotional hijacks. Of course, that's tactical. Align your negotiation team around a clear mandate. We know that teams negotiate better than solos as long as they have prepared together. You want your team to prepare together. So this is all tactical. This is the tactical side of negotiation. And I'm sure you've read a lot about this. I don't know if there's any questions here. Okay, very important. You have to be very good at this. But that's not the only thing. You have the value dimension side of negotiation. And the value dimension side of negotiation is, how do I maximize value capture? And I do that by first creating value and then claiming value. So you want to do this well, you want to define interests, priorities, preferences, and targets. This first part, because this is what will help you create value. The targets, which is when they're well designed, because that's what will help you claim value effectively. So we gave the key accounts more ambitious targets, because we know that when we give people more ambitious targets, they negotiate better, as long as the targets are realistic, of course. You want to try to map the ZOPA, zone of possible agreement. That means, what is my reservation point? What is the reservation point if I can't find it, because sometimes I can't. We're going to not going to be able. Yeah, we're going to talk about mesos this afternoon. Multiple equivalent simultaneous offers is one of my favorite techniques in negotiation. Use a scoring system in complex negotiations to know value. When we were negotiating the free trade agreement with the United States, we were negotiating 24 topics. By topics, I mean agricultural issues, labor issues, environmental issues, government contracts, non-tariff barriers, stuff like that. So we have 500 issues, and the only way we could keep track of those issues is with a point system. So that's when you use point systems, one of the reasons. Most of all, what negotiators are really good at is finding trade-offs. How do I trade off? Because negotiating is simply a very sophisticated way of talking about bartering. We've been bartering all our life. You know, I'll give you this if you give me that. That's what I do with my kid anyway. Uncover hidden value, employ post-settlement settlement. These are all techniques to increase value. So there's a whole value dimension, which has to do with the mindset. This is not a zero-sum game. How can we find trade-offs that put more value on the table? That's the main challenge of an effective negotiator, or one of the main challenges. And then, let me give you an example here because I think this is important and maybe it'll resonate with you. We were helping a packaging company in a negotiation with one of the huge pharmaceuticals in the US because they had sold them some defective bottles. By defective bottles, I mean medicine bottles. By defective medicine bottles, I mean the bottles have had holes in them. And so the pharmaceutical had to do a huge recall, very costly, opportunity cost. They had lost lots of sales. They had lost lots of product they had to throw away because once it was exposed to oxygen or whatever, they had to throw the product away. They couldn't repackage it. And of course, reputational damage. So legal counsel of the corporation, not yet jokes about lawyers, legal counsel of the corporations were negotiating, both legal counsels. The pharmaceutical legal counsel team was saying, you owe me $40 million. And they had the numbers, right? They justified. You owe me so much for product loss. You owe me so much for recall logistics. You owe me so much for sales. And this is my estimate of the reputational impact. Of course, legal counsel of our customer was arguing the opposite. And of course, they were threatening each other. We're going to end up in arbitration, and you know that arbiters in these type of situations favor the customer, so you're going to end up even paying more than $40 million. Typical negotiation. If you think about that, what are the lawyers doing? They're focusing on the outcome, not the process. The outcome is how can I maximize the claim compensation or how can I minimize the claim compensation? And the negotiation is going to be zero sum because more for you is less for me. So we engage with the VP of sales and say, okay, let's do something that's fundamental in negotiation. Let's zoom out. This is the tree. This problem is the tree. Let's look at the forest. What is the motivation of the pharmaceutical and particularly of the key account who's negotiating this? No, the motivation of the key account is they want to look good with their boss because they realize that it was sort of a disaster. They're not going to drop us. We have a very good relationship. They know that this happens once in a while. It's happened before, not to this level, but it happened before. So they're going there's no risk in the relationship. There's no threats about ending the relationship. Because they like our product, they dual source, so we have 50% of their wallet share. So they're going to continue buying from us. I think, of course, they want the most compensation, and I think for the key account, saving face with its boss is very important. Okay, what about you? No, but this is one of our largest customers. We have 50% of wallet share. We wouldn't mind increasing the wallet share, but that sort of hasn't been very, very easy. And the other thing we would have liked, I'm simplifying the story, is we would like a longer-term contract because we need to buy some new machines and the CapEx, we want to make sure that is depreciated, that we can depreciate it over several years. So if we could have a 3-year contract and maybe increase our wallet share to 65, that would be lovely. So we went to legal counsel and we said, okay, why don't you do this? You improve the compensation and in exchange of that trade-offs, you ask for a 3-year contract and a 65% wallet share. Reaction of legal counsel? They loved it? No, you complicated my negotiation. This has nothing to do with me. I mean, my job is to negotiate a compensation. This is your key accounts. Don't mix things. In negotiation, adding issues is a great way of expanding the pie. So to make the story short, we ended up forcing the legal counsel to propose a deal, and we ended up with a compensation of $15 million, a 60% wallet share, so an increase of 10% wallet share, and a 3-year contract. Where did the value come from to go from 15 from 5 to 15? Additional volume and longer contract. So that was win-win. But legal counsel could have never seen this because they did not have the information. So, so unless we brought that information to legal counsel, to in-house counsel, sorry, they would have never found this deal. So in my experience, when you do your job, more often than not, you're surprised by additional value that you can put on the table. Does that make sense? And finally, strategic dimension. And we're almost done before you engage in negotiations. The strategic dimension has to do with the balance of power. And of course, what would we like in a negotiation? More power, no? It's more fun to have more power than to have less power. The first problem we see is that people, well, you have to assess the stakeholders, you have to do a bunch of stuff, but basically a problem we see recurrent is people don't know how to assess the balance of power well, or don't necessarily know how to assess the balance of power well, or don't assess the balance of power well. They almost equally often underestimate their power, which ends up in too many concessions, or overestimate their power, which ends up in arrogance and can make the negotiation very competitive, zero sum, or even break the negotiation. Neither is good. We were helping the same company, and this is just because the story is good, not because I always choose stories from this company, but this was the packaging for food division. And they were negotiating, they had to negotiate a contract with one of the largest beverage companies in the US. And the beverage company, and this is we worked a lot with procurement, and they were doing a technique that's called conditioning. Conditioning is anchoring in a way. And what they did is they sent a blanket email to all the suppliers and said, look, you are a key partner to us. We are on a drive for cost reduction this year, and we know you're going to support us with this. What are they telling you? You're going to have to lower your prices. Basically, that's the message. To our customers specifically, they had sent an email saying, we need a 5% discount. So the key accounts were just out of themselves. How are we going to give them 5%? That doesn't even give us the margin. We don't even break even. And 90% of our capacity goes to this customer. I mean, this is a disaster. Very, very nervous. So we came in. Again, one of the VPs called us and said, okay, no, okay, slow down. Let me rewind a bit. The person who has the most power in negotiation is the person who's the least dependent on the negotiation to meet their interest. That's how we define power. And that is determined by your BADNA and by their BADNA. That's what determines the balance of power. That's why BADNAs are so important. So yes, you have a really bad BADNA. If they don't buy from you, you have to close your plant. What are you going to do with 90% of your volume? But let me ask you a question. What is their BADNA? You say, well, okay, their BADNA, they would have to buy from 4 suppliers. There's no supplier that can give them the volume we can give them, okay? Well, that's not really good because they have to qualify those suppliers, and that implies logistical complexities and costs because they have to stop the production line to try the new bottles. And these suppliers are, this was one of the large states in the US, they're not like us. We were right next to the bottling facility. They would have to transport the bottles from different places, and transporting bottle is transporting air. That's pretty expensive. And on top of that, none of those suppliers have a 5% reduction in price available readily. Short-term, long-term, long story short, as you like to say, we ended up increasing the price because we understood the balance of power. But a lot of times people don't do that. They don't really assess the balance of power. They stick with a supplier and they don't question themselves, am I creating enough competition to find new suppliers? Okay. So the first thing is to assess the balance of power and then to shift the balance of power. and this is another story. Very often my friends call me and says, look, I'm in love with this house. Can you help me negotiate it because I want to get good conditions? My answer immediately is, we're starting from a bad situation. Please fall in love with 3 other houses and then come back to me, right? This applies to houses, of course. So you want to develop badness. A good negotiator is always asking themselves, how can I improve my badna? How can I make their badna less attractive? In M&As, I see almost rigorously, and I'm doing a deal just now, they always ask for a 6-month exclusivity. There are some reasons for that. You have due diligence and whatever. It's costly. But if I accept as a seller a 6-month exclusivity, what's happening to my badna? I have no badna for 6 months. That's a way in which they make your badna worse. They take away your badna for 6 months by accepting exclusivity. So shrewd negotiators think about these things systematically. Does that make sense? Okay, questions up to here about the 3 dimensions? So what am I telling you? I'm telling you, look, sometimes you may not have too much power. Then you have to ask yourself, how can I shift the balance of power? Can I improve my badna? Can I worsen their badna? Maybe I cannot do anything here. Can I improve the value that I put on the table? Because if there is enough value, we may not even have to discuss power. I mean, the sisters, when they discover that one want the peel and the other one's the pulp, they don't have to discuss who's more powerful or who's right. Or do I need to do tactical work because trust is fundamental, because exchanging information is fundamental. So you want to make sure you're leveraging the 3 dimensions. Okay. This is just very quickly. There's research that shows that when you're very well prepared, that you will, if you look at the 3 dimensions, you feel more confident, and confidence has a dual effect. It increases or it protects your emotional intelligence, and you interact in a much more effective way, but it generates perceived power on your counterpart. When you sit down at the negotiation table, not arrogant, confident, the other party reads that as, oh, they must have a very good badna. So there's something to say to be very well prepared, which brings us to the use of our practical tools. And you will have access to these. I'll send you a PDF form that you can use freely, share with everybody, use it as if you want to document your negotiations. 70% of success in negotiation is preparation. This is Kellogg's version. Harvard is even more dramatic. Harvard says it's 90%, but whatever, you take whatever you like better. So we developed this, and you may be familiar with this type of tools. You probably worked before with the business model canvas from Osterwalder, Strategizer. Have you worked with that? I thought it was brilliant. I mean, when I did strategy, I loved that. So we came up with this, with the same idea. If we have everybody preparing the same way, documenting the same way, conducting the negotiation from the same perspective, we're going to negotiate better. And this covers the 3 dimensions. Look, it's very easy. My interest, I want to drink juice. Her interest, she wants to bake a cake. My badna, I can complain to my mother. That won't be very good. My mother won't be happy. Her badna, she can complain to my mother. That won't be very good. She won't be very happy. There is a balance of power in this negotiation. Issues. Oh, we don't have to negotiate the orange. We can unbundle the issues. The more issues you put on the table, the more potential for trade-offs. So now the issue is not the orange. The issue is who keeps the peel and who keeps the pulp. Does that make sense? Priorities. Well, I have a 3-star priority over the pulp because I want to make juice, and she has a 3-star priority over the peel because she wants to bake a cake. And I have a 1-star and she has a 1-star respectively. That's an obvious trade-off. Now that I know that we have asymmetric priorities, I'm going to offer her the peel in exchange of the pulp. That's a trade-off. My target is not the orange anymore. Initially it was, I want as much of the orange as possible. Now my target is, I want to get 100% of the pulp. That's a much more intelligent target because it's based on my understanding of the interests and priorities of each party. Does that make sense? Then I can make proposals. We'll talk about mesos later, so I won't go into details. And a good agreement hygiene is to write an agreement that I know will be implementable. That's a negotiation. There's nothing, there's nothing more to it. And you cover the 3 dimensions there, the tactical, the value, and the strategic dimension with one tool. So very simple, and you're all done. The idea is that you will use this to prepare your negotiations, conduct your negotiations, evaluate, or a similar tool, document your negotiations, learn from that. One of the things we realize is some negotiations are similar because I'm negotiating with the same customer or the same supplier next year, or because this supplier is similar to these other suppliers. So why don't I learn? Of course, that will help me standardize certain negotiations because they're very similar, and optimize, hopefully, the way I negotiate. So this tool or whatever tool you use. And this is the other one that I think is terribly important. Good negotiators focus on the process and not on the outcome. That's what gives you control over the negotiation. You want to prepare. You need to prepare. Then you want to increase your power. So can I find new houses? Then you need to build trust. And this is one that I want to emphasize because everybody says trust is important, but they don't, once they engage in negotiation, they don't really pay attention to it, especially when we're monochronic because we think it's a waste of time. So a story, so you never forget this idea of trust. We were biking with a friend some years ago. Colombia is full of mountains. We have the second highest range of mountains in the world. So we go up quite a bit. And this was like a whole day trip, him and I. And we started going up the mountain. And often other bikers who are alone or couples, they join you because it's more fun to bike in a group. And this guy was really funny. He was always complaining, God, you're too good bikers. I'm suffering here, but thank you for letting me join you. We stopped to rest. He gave us energy bars. Well, we spent like 3 hours biking with the guy. We went back to Bogota. We went to a cafe. We talked about what bikers talk, which were very boring, about bikes and trips. His son arrived, so we started talking about bikes with his son. His son wanted to buy a new bike. He had a hardtail and he wanted a full suspension. So my friend very kindly said, well, look, why don't you try my bike? So they both went around the block to try the bike, never came back. That's called the confidence man, right? So there's a long con and there's a short con. This was a short con. Look how powerful trust is. I'm not telling you that you do this in negotiation. I'm just illustrating the power. But I want to show you that trust is built systematically. He used the following techniques. He used FaceTime, 3 hours, 4 hours with us. The more time you spend with someone, the more they trust you. He used vulnerability. You're really good bikers. I'm suffering here. I'm vulnerable. He used praise. You're really good bikers. He used reciprocity. Here is a power bar. By the end of the trip, we completely trusted the guy. It never occurred to us that he would steal the bike from my friend. Thank God my friend was short and I was tall. He didn't take my bike. But what I love this story because it shows you how intentionally trust building is so powerful. So you do have to do a strategic plan to build trust with your counterpart. And of course, if you're negotiating across cultures, how do you build trust with that culture? Does that make sense? Then, of course, information exchange, then building offers or counter offers, which is the fundamental part of negotiation, and then agreement. So what does it mean to focus on the process and not on the outcome? You control the process. We won't have time to do this exercise today because we have only until 5, I understand, or are we negotiating that already? So 5. I usually record this first case that you do, and I show you something that's fascinating. The process is reciprocal. When you build trust, they reciprocate building trust 90% of the time, 95. Of course, there's 5% that with whom it doesn't work. But if you manage 95% of your negotiations to manage the process, you're really ahead. So when I start building trust, the other person builds trust. When I start exchanging information, the other person starts exchanging information. Each organization, each person will redesign the process to their best, the best application. We have a process in our company. and it's a 3-meeting process, and we call it that. If a customer calls you and asks you they want a workshop, and you can ask Jeff how that worked for him, usually I get an email that says, we've heard really good things about you, we want a 3-day workshop, can you quote it for us? My response, thank you for your interest. I would like a 15-minute, half an hour meeting with you to make sure that we understand your challenges, your needs, and we can design the workshop to your purpose. 95% of the time, I get the meeting. Then I go before the meeting on LinkedIn. I invite my counterpart to LinkedIn so they can see my profile, trust building. I see their profile, and I usually discover interesting things. He's a mountain biker. She went to Kellogg, I don't know. And that helps me plan for building trust, right? And now with GPT, we have even prompts that says, okay, tell me this person is in procurement. What are the main challenges of this company in procurement when it comes to negotiate? You get amazing stuff. Of course, you have to read it carefully, but you get a lot of information. So we have a whole strategy to build trust and start building information and discovering since the beginning. In that meeting, one rule is we don't present slides unless the customer asks for a very specific something. Because I used to be the old school that I love my product, so the poor customer would have to go through my 30 slides before they could even talk about what they wanted. No, not anymore. Next meeting, we go in and we present a proposal with no numbers, no financial numbers. Because as soon as you put price on the proposal, they'll go back to price. So we present 3 offers. I said, we could do this workshop or this, whatever. Oh, I like this. 3rd meeting, proposal with price. We never send the proposal. Never send the proposal until the end, after the 3rd meeting. Why? You don't send proposals. Why? You lose control. Once you send the proposal, if they don't like it, you cannot salvage the deal. Say, oh, too expensive, ciao, you don't get an answer. And you miss the opportunity of observing their reaction. Because as you observe the reaction to the proposal, you keep on understanding their interests, their priorities, and their preferences much better. So that's the reason we don't send proposals. That's our process. You will design your own process, but that's the way we do it.